Today's episode is brought to you by Focal, a global leader in high-fidelity solutions since 1979. Focal presents the new Celeste headphones that deliver an uncompromising audio quality, feature a modern design and a blue finish, and showcase the French brand's savoir-faire in audio. Be part of the Focal experience at focal.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by Shit Audio. Shit Audio designs and builds audio components in California. Based in Valencia, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit shit.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's www.schit.com. Just a small disclaimer before we kick off this week's show. The views expressed in this podcast are diverse, and we allow for all schools of thought to join the conversation around some of the more controversial subject matter that often pops up when people start talking about how to budget audio systems. On this podcast, our guest, Jonathan Derda, outlines the way he perceives the best performance to get out of any audio system and bases budgeting upon that. The product range he discusses is quite diverse, and we encourage everyone to consider the more controversial products of this hobby with an open mind. But I don't specifically endorse the idea that you spend money on something you're not comfortable with. Since Jonathan doesn't really omit anything in terms of product categories in his guide, I just want to have everybody keep in mind, listen to things for yourself and make decisions based upon what works for you in your system. Have fun with the hobby. On with the show. Here we go. You have reached the Occasional Podcast, Season 5, Episode 2. How to, budget for audio gear from entry level to high end. So in this particular episode, we are joined by Jonathan Derda of MoFi. Thank you so much for joining, man.
Hey, thanks, Brian.
We are going to discuss, with the help of John, how to budget for your audio gears. A different way to think about how much to spend per area. And just to kind of establish where we're coming from here, let's think about it in these terms. There are speakers or transducers that could also include headphones, amplifiers, which can include preamps or power amps, or an integrated that covers both, and sources. And as a subcategory of that, realistically, there is also two other categories that kind of people in the audiophile realm think of, but maybe the mainstream misses a little bit more, and that would be power conditioning and cables. So John has some really interesting thoughts on the subject, but I wanted to kind of talk about first on how traditionally people have thought about these categories. And that is, budgeting often starts with the transducer. So the transducer is the component that makes the sound, right? So it creates a sound. Therefore, a lot of weight is placed on that. Some people have argued 30% of your total budget. Some people have said 50%. It's hotly debated kind of a thing, but a lot of emphasis has always been put on that. I'd say, and John, you can jump in here at any time, from my experience, the transducer is important, but one of the overarching ideas is that everything does make a difference. And if you got that kind of established, you could say that every bit of this deserves a little bit of money, but how much is really the question. John, what's your take on all that?
Sure, yeah. I think recapping kind of where we've been is a good idea, and exactly. I mean, people say spend 80% of your budget on speakers, or 20% of your budget on cables is kind of a common refrain you hear in our industry. Or famously from Lynn, hey, pick your source first, because everything else after that is going to be influenced by the source. And the thing is, all of this can be true, right? The industry's kind of full of dogma and contradictions, and it would be easy to be cynical about that and walk away more confused than ever. But I think what we're trying to establish here is a guide, a hierarchy for building a system, especially from the perspective of somebody who hasn't done it before or hasn't built a system in a long time, and just helping guide that person. And when you talk about speakers, I mean, I think that's one thing that's consistently right. Speakers are going to present the most obvious and biggest differences between brands and models, and that's why so much emphasis is placed on choosing your speakers first before everything else. And I think as even part of our hierarchy we're building out here, that's still going to be the first piece of gear that you pick out is the speakers.
And since they do make the sound, I can see the logic for 50% or 80%. And that's like, I would think that you might get a lot of traction out of that. You could be like, hey, I spend most of my money on the speakers. But I also kind of have experienced myself over time that each kind of component brings different qualities to the sound, right? So if you have a really bad source, you're not going to really get the fidelity. You know, there's a lot of like detail that can be drawn out of the original source, even the source file. The amplifier, if it's weak and smushy, it's going to have a really kind of lax or not lively sound, but it can also affect the overall fidelity. And then the same with the preamp. Now, while we're talking about this, some people might be confused, John. Yeah, can you add some color to what you think makes a preamp so special within the chain, like its responsibilities and kind of how it affects the sound?
Yeah, well, I think your point of the influences of all these different aspects on the end result is what we're going to really try to uncover or demystify for people. And the preamp's a great example of that, because you'll hear people have different opinions on the same speaker, right? And a lot of that can be influenced by the electronics. The preamp is really commonly, in my experience, the weakest link in a lot of systems that I've seen over the years. And it's so misunderstood, because on paper it sounds like this should be a simple device. You're switching your inputs, you're changing volume, maybe you have some tone controls on there, and that's really it. But preamps are really easy to get wrong, and they're often the choke point of a system. So you look at your options out there. You can have a passive preamplifier, which those kind of go in and out of fashion pretty often. It's like every 5 years you'll see a new slate of people calling for passive preamps. Those are preamps without active electronics in them. Basically, it's an input selector and a volume control. It doesn't plug in. It doesn't add any gain to the signal. And I think famously people, maybe Stereophile was the first to say that, there's no preamp like no preamp. And basically they're saying you want that straight wire with gain sound. And in theory, a passive preamp gives you that. But in reality, I would say a good passive preamp is better than a bad active one. But a good active preamp almost always outperforms a good passive preamplifier, because it adds energy and drive to the sound that a passive preamp just can't replicate. And the same goes with coming straight out of your source device. So a lot of DACs, CD players, phono preamps, they may have a volume control built in, but that's just a very simple potentiometer on there. That's not as good as using an active preamplifier. It's just not the same experience. And this is an area where to get a good preamp, you're going to pay good money because they're hard to make. They require great power supplies, great components. Everything has to be accounted for. There's a lot of parts matching, critical parts matching that happens. So there's a lot of hands-on time. It's just not an area where there's a great economy of scale for the most part to be able to bring prices down. So a good active preamp is going to cost good money.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways to think about it that's been said to me, at least in the past, is that it's the point where you're dealing with the sound where it is very precious. It goes along with the idea that you don't want a choke point. You don't want there to be a too small of a hole to push the pipe through. You want it to be tenderly cared for when it's moving up the amplification chain, essentially, right? So when you deal with it there, you don't want to introduce too much, because the aggregate, right, of an issue could be amplified right at that point. Before we get into the next part, a word about this episode's sponsor. Today's episode is also sponsored by Inuos. Inuos develops high-fidelity digital music players that are transforming the way we listen to music. Every nuance and detail is revealed, allowing one to experience their music like never before. Enjoy your own library of CDs and high-resolution files, and access to all the content in the world through streaming services and internet radio. All at your fingertips through an exceedingly simple user interface on a mobile device. Visit inuos.com to learn more. That's www.inuos.com. And in the same kind of context, there are what they call active loudspeakers. A loudspeaker where the amplifier is inherently integrated along with the speaker, usually in the same box. And I think that's a very unique situation because obviously we were talking about preamps, but in this scenario, not only is there the absence of an external preamp, but the active power amp is also in the speaker. And when you have this kind of thing where traditional amplifiers have to be made to accommodate all manner of loudspeakers. They have to accommodate ones with sensitivities and all kinds of different things. They're trying like the greatest average for the greatest, widest group even. With the active speaker, that amplifier is finely tuned for a single transducer or the single pair of transducers within the speaker. So there are some advantages to that. John, do you have any other color to that kind of?
Well, I think you covered a lot of the main benefits. I mean, if you're working with a speaker designer, they have their own reference amplifier. They might have multiple reference amplifiers because they're thinking it from their perspective that, okay, we have to match our speaker to all these different use case scenarios, and the different amplifiers all sound different from each other, and so they have to have multiple references. But when they design a speaker, they have in their mind what they really want it to sound like. And by giving that speaker designer the chance to build an amplifier that's optimized specifically for their speaker, you're kind of getting the whole painting from the one artist, right? You don't have multiple people kind of putting their brushstrokes on the canvas. It's, hey, this amplifier has the appropriate power, damping factor, frequency response, etc., to give you the results of what I think these speakers should be able to do. So I think there's a benefit of simplicity, of kind of honoring exactly what the original speaker designer wanted you to hear. But some of the downsides are, well, there's less of an upgrade path, obviously, if you're somebody who likes switching things out. I mean, to me, part of the fun of this hobby is playing with different gear. You know, the music comes first, but the gear comes a close second, for me at least, and that's the experience. You can't really do that easily with active loudspeakers. You know, if you need bigger speakers, well, you're also ditching your amplifier at that point. So there's pros and cons to it, but I think especially nowadays with active speakers becoming so prevalent, becoming so good, that's a great kind of value for somebody getting into this hobby, is to look at active speakers.
Yeah, and also when size is a consideration. I mean, these are a lot of times are things in studios that just go on either side of a computer monitor in a room. There are also active loudspeakers that are full-size, floor-standing loudspeakers. So there's a lot of variety out there in the audiophile realm, but they make, I mean, the studio guys really do make some amazing stuff at the higher end, and even in the budget. So you can think about it in terms of, hey, this is a way to save money and space, but you can also go much deeper with it with a lot of really renowned brands that are out there. So
yeah. I think another example of it is, you know, we import a brand from Germany called Manger, which has this really kind of unique driver technology called bending wave. And due to the unique nature of this driver, I mean, we could listen to half a dozen amplifiers that are all very expensive, very well regarded, but they might not show the best performance of the Manger loudspeakers. And that's a company that offers both passive and active versions of their speakers. And it's funny that, you know, with their active version, there's very few amplifiers that I've heard that you can buy out of the box that sound as good as the active version. So again, that simplicity of choice of just hearing exactly what that designer intends you to hear, active's a great way to go.
Sometimes people throw around the word synergy.
Synergy is absolutely real. You know, so for the listeners, what are we talking about when we talk about synergy? I mean, it sounds obvious. It's like a business MBA term you hear a lot. We have synergy. But with a system, we're talking about balancing the strengths and apparent weaknesses of a system. So you'll often hear, hey, if you have bright speakers, you want to partner that with a warm amp. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but that's the gist of synergy. So synergy is real, and I think especially in the budget end of building a hi-fi system, it's a good approach, and it's a good way to experiment. But I think as you go higher up the food chain in a high-end system, to me, synergy makes less sense. You're always going to have some synergy because certain things just don't work well with each other and some things work better with each other. But I think instead of the gross oversimplification of pairing warm with cool to get balance, in high end, you really just want clean, clear, neutral, good components. And as you get better and better components, I think synergy becomes less of an issue unless you're dealing with a particular brand that has such a strong house sound. But at that point, to me, that's not like high fidelity. That's more of a coloration and a flavor that you're going after. If you're trying to build a true system around the sense of fidelity or clarity or lack of distortion, synergy, I think, is less of a thing to concern yourself with.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting kind of sub point, I think, too, is that a lot of times when people enter this hobby, I think there's some frustration on their side when they don't hear the differences that other people claim to hear. Now, I'll be the first to say there's plenty of BS out there to read and to hear that's not really part of the hobby. That's just people talking or have whatever going on. However, one of the things that I would caution some people who get frustrated is that as you move up the chain, the effect of each component slowly becomes more and more clear if you have the pass-through fidelity all the way to the end. Simply put, if you have a much higher-end speaker, I feel like hopefully the goal is that you can more clearly hear the impact of each part. Would you say that's true in your experience, John?
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue to dive into speakers. The speakers, like we said earlier, are going to present the most obvious differences between models. And ultimately, the reason we start with speakers is because they have such a strong voice that while they're affected by all the components upstream, they all also have an inherent ceiling due to its design and its materials. So there's always going to be a peak quality to a loudspeaker, no matter how much money you pump through it. So you might not notice a great difference between the $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 amplifier with your speakers due to its own limitations. And there's good reason for that. Speakers, and this is one of the things I don't understand. It's not covered more, especially in the review process. Speakers have the highest amount of distortion of anything in your system. So when we talk about, this amplifier has, 1% distortion, but this one has 0.01%, so it's so much better. Well, but your speakers have 5% distortion or 10% or more. And so who cares how much little distortion when we're getting down to the fractions with amplifiers? It's not going to make a difference when your speakers have 10% distortion. Yeah, it's a little, to your point, when people say, well, I can't hear the difference, that could be just a built-in limitation of the speakers they happen to have, or even more commonly, the room, and then how those speakers are set up in the room.
Let's get into the weeds of it here, because you had talked about earlier, establishing a hierarchy of benefits to each component. What's your take on the whole situation? Yeah,
when you called me a few months ago about this idea, I had kind of a loose hierarchy already established in my mind. One of the things that I always loved doing was building systems for people when I worked in audio retail. I worked at my dad's shop from when I was like 8 years old, worked at another great retailer in Colorado called Listen Up, and you meet all kinds of people looking for a new system, and they have budgets from a few $100s to, sky's the limit sometimes. But the hierarchy was always the same. When these people came in, especially if they didn't have a lot of experience, you first educate people about recordings, the quality of the recording. That's kind of your base layer of this hierarchy that, hey, no matter what you spend, if it's not on the record, it's not going to come out of the system. So you want to pay attention to the quality of the recording, and that's why Diana Krall gets played so much, because it's good quality at these hi-fi shows. But even other acts, you might have a favorite Who record, that there's different pressings of that record on vinyl or different issues on CD or even different versions uploaded on streaming services, and they all sound a little bit different. So I think that's a inexpensive way to get the best sound possible and to really make it about the music first is focusing on recordings first and foremost. The second layer of that hierarchy is another thing that you can't go buy. Well, I guess you can, but normally you don't go buy at a store. It's your room, the quality of the room that you're putting your system in. And people, they should know that by now, but I still see this mistake happen over and over again, that you're putting your system in a room that's 10 by 10 with glass walls. Well, if you could spend $100,000 on speakers and you're not going to get good sound. It doesn't matter. Your room is often the limiting factor in how high your system can go in terms of sound quality. So really thinking about your room, trying to understand the limitations of your space, because most of us can't just go build a dedicated room. Try to address those limitations with treatment or with just natural things like plants or bookcases or drapes, and work within them. I would always ask customers, the first question would be, how big is your room? How far away do you sit? What does your room look like? And that kind of that eliminates a lot of options right off the bat, because there's going to be speakers that are simply too big or too small for the room. So that's 1 and 2, recording and room.
What is the quality of a speaker that's too big for a room?
It can be surprising and counterintuitive, but I mean, you, especially being around the show circuit, you've probably seen 8-foot tall speakers with 15-inch woofers stuffed into tiny standard-sized hotel rooms, and there's a lack of bass. Because the speakers are too big for the room, the reflections are bouncing off the walls, canceling each other out. So having speakers that are too large can actually result in less bass than what you'd want, or it can result, obviously, in boomy, overpronounced bass. It's kind of a variable depending on your room dimensions. But you can easily overdrive or overfill a room with speakers that are too large, or not be able to space the speakers apart far enough either to achieve a good soundstage. So finding the right size for your room is kind of an important part of this.
Yeah, and I think, too, with the idea of standing waves, sometimes people have said that if you walk around the room, the amount of bass can go from being boomy to really thin, depending if things are really messed up in the room. So it's one of those things that you really have to pay attention to when you're kind of putting together a system.
It's critical. And I think connecting recording then to room, the next tier up on this hierarchy is going to be speakers, but room and speakers are tied together due to what you're talking about, how those waves fill the room, and where you position the speakers in the room is critical. And there's always going to be an optimum spot for the listening position and for the loudspeakers. So before we even start talking about, buying anything, let's figure out what's going to work within this space, because again, a lot of people have kind of fixed positions of their couch or their chairs of where these speakers can go, and you try to find speakers that work within those limitations to the best of their ability. I think there's one more question you have to answer before you can really guide somebody towards speakers. It's what do you listen to and how do you like to listen? Because we would often get customers that come in, it's like, hey, I just want this for background music, and I listen to a little bit of, Baroque classical or what have you. That's going to be a very different person than a speaker for that person than somebody who comes in and says, I love death metal, and I want to melt my face off every time I listen. Like you're going to maybe steer person A towards a nice bookshelf with, great mid-range clarity, and person B is going to get a big pair of horn speakers that can really load the room, right? So it's going to be different depending on that person's taste. And that's really the reality. I mean, a lot of people say, I listen to all kinds of music, but 90% of the time, there's going to be certain genres and certain volumes that person listens to. And so you try to optimize around that use case scenario, what those speakers are. To answer your question, when you have a big room, you can sometimes get away with a smaller bookshelf loudspeaker, but in general, physics are physics. You need to have a certain amount of radiating surface area to kind of load that room and to fill it with, a satisfying amount of bass, especially. So in general, you're going to lean towards a larger speaker or a pair of bookshelf speakers or stand-mount speakers with a subwoofer, if that's an option.
So we have this hierarchy. We have room. We have the consideration of, what type of music you play, the relationship of the room to the speakers, obviously the quality of the recording, all really important stuff. Now let's get down to brass tacks. The thing I think a lot of people I want to know about speakers, John. Tell me about the best speaker for me.
Yeah, so we found out there's going to be certain practical considerations, but then you're right. People, well, how much do I spend to get a good pair of speakers? And I think this is probably the most interesting part of the industry to me, is that speakers have gotten really good for the money. The price to performance ratio, and there is a ratio, there's a curve, is very high with loudspeakers nowadays. And I think that's due to improvements in materials, in economy of scale. A lot of these speakers are being built in Asian factories where they're extremely efficient, using state-of-the-art automated equipment to build these things. And so you're getting great value for money with loudspeakers right now. You can get great speakers for $200, brand new. That $200 to $500 pair range seems to be a sweet spot for a lot of folks. And you just can get some phenomenal stuff. Now, typically that's going to be more of a bookshelf style design, a two-way like you like here, maybe a 5 1/4 or 6.5 inch two-way, which for an average size room, a 6.5 inch two-way, especially in the United States, is going to give you pretty good room-filling, rich sound with good bass down to around 40, 45 hertz, which is really where most music kind of stops. Most naturally recorded music, at least, doesn't go much lower than that. So you're going to get something very satisfying for under $500 a pair right now. And I think some examples of that are, ELAC, obviously, what Andrew Jones has been doing over there, with Pioneer before that. One of the brands we import, Wharfdale, is considered super high value for money. There's a handful of these brands that I think have really focused on that category, and the customers have come out ahead, especially in the last 5 years when it comes to loudspeakers. But even going up to that $1,000 to $1,500 a pair range, that seems to be another sweet spot where you're getting tremendous value, that you're getting better materials. Usually it looks better. You might be getting real wood veneers or piano black as opposed to like a flat black veneer or vinyl finish. And let's not kid ourselves. The way speakers look especially matters when it comes to building out your system, because you got to look at these things all day. You want them to look nice. You're getting better materials, better crossover components, usually a bigger loudspeaker, maybe even a 3-way tower at that point, so you can fill a larger room. So, this all goes back to the hierarchy and the idea of budgeting. You might build a system that you're not going to spend 50, 60, or 80% of your budget on speakers like the rule of thumb of the past. You might actually spend more on your amplifier than what you paid for your speakers, because speakers have just gotten so good at those lower price points. But the other thing I found is with these lower price point speakers, they still require a really great amplifier to get the most out of them. And so that kind of goes to the next step in the hierarchy, is talking about amplifiers and getting what you pay for. So just like with preamps, you can't really skimp out on an amplifier. There might be some examples out there that are super high value, but the things that cost a lot of money that make an amplifier sound the way it does, like transformers, great capacitors, parts matching, obviously tubes if it's a tube amplifier. Those things cost real money that you could buy a whole lot of them as a manufacturer, and it's still going to cost a lot of money. So I think as a customer, at the end of the day, the amplifier, you really get what you pay for as well. And that's another area where I think it's a great investment, that, look, the technology and basic circuits haven't changed that much over the years, aside from maybe the evolution of Class D amps, that you could buy a great amp now, and 20 years from now, it's still going to be a great amp.
That's a great point. I don't think the same can be said about sources. Unfortunately, I think on the digital side, we're still seeing things evolve a little bit faster, but the really good news is things from a digital source perspective sound so much better for less money than they did just 10, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, probably not 30 years ago, but at least 10 or 20. It's really come a long way, I think, even in the last 10 years, in my opinion. Do you have an opinion on that, John?
Yeah, I think sources is an area I've probably got the most kind of hands-on experience with, behind the scenes, working with our manufacturers on DACs, on turntables, and I think in the digital area, you're right. I mean, I go back to my early days at Peachtree, and what you got for $500 then seemed like great value. This was, I don't know, 13 years ago. But that $500 DAC today isn't even close to what a $500 DAC gets you now. Right? It's just, they have come such a long way, and I think this is another interesting area where, yeah, the source is going to make a huge impact on the overall sound that you get from your system, but it doesn't mean that you have to earmark a high percentage of your budget towards the source. At least when it comes to digital, you can get a phenomenal digital source. I have one on my desk here, like this little Dragonfly Red. I don't know what they sell for, a couple $100 maybe. That thing sounds great. It's incredible. Yeah, so you have that. You have iFi. You have a lot of these Chinese brands that might not be recognizable brand names coming out with DACs that offer phenomenal value for money. So I think digital is an exciting place to be, where you're just going to get really good gear right now and not have to spend a ton to get great digital. Yeah, that's not saying that you can't get better digital as you spend more money. It's certainly true if you go up to something like, a big DCS DAC, that it does sound better than your $500.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it sounds better than a $500 Chi-Fi DAC, but it's a lot more. So I think that whole law of diminishing returns, if you kind of think of it on the curve, it's not as steep when it comes to digital, that price-performance ratio right now. So that's exciting for customers, that if you're streaming, get a nice streamer, or use your laptop with a good DAC. You don't have to spend a ton.
How does that kind of idea translate to turntables in your experience?
I think if you go back to our whole turntable discussion a few months ago that we did, I recommended some good turntables that you can get for under $500. But really, turntables, to me, you get what you pay for, just like with amplifiers. That if you spend more, you will get a lot more when it comes to turntables. And so there's some sweet spots of kind of a 250 at entry level to 500 to 1,000. There's little kind of mile markers along the way, but you're always going to get more when you spend more with turntables. And that's because these products are not automated for manufacture like DACs, right? You don't have these circuit boards going through a pick-and-place machine moving 1,000 miles an hour just putting parts on a board. There's a lot of skilled labor involved in manufacturing a turntable, a lot of hands-on human time in manufacturing a turntable that you just can't make more efficient without sacrificing the quality. Same thing with the materials that go into turntables. Usually they require bigger, harder to machine materials to make better sounding tables. So I think that's another thing, that you're going to pay more and it's worth it when you're buying a turntable.
Do you think if someone was to, even though this is definitely not a consideration for most people, but if they were choosing between turntable sources and digital, do you see more gains at lower price levels from digital or turntables?
Oh, that's a tough question.
I'm going to say at the same price, like at any given price. We're going to make it even more complicated. Any given price, be it 500 or 1,000, how does that like change from each level? Like, do you get more gains at the lower end? Do you really start to see analog blossom past digital at some point up the price scale?
That's a tough question to answer because there's so many variables involved. The most obvious is talking about the recording, going back to kind of like the base tier of this hierarchy. Often the mastering for a record is different than the mastering done for digital. And so you already have this variable that makes this whole comparison unscientific, right? There's no control there. So I'll tell you an anecdotal story without answering your question, really. We've done these comparison A/B tests using files from Mobile Fidelity that are mastered exactly the same way, digital versus analog. And we've done them in front of hundreds of people at a time. And almost every time, the majority of people prefer what they hear from the analog. from
Heresy.
the vinyl.
Just kidding.
No, yeah. I mean, I really came into that with no expectations. I know I prefer the analog, quite frankly, but the digital is really good too. So for that to still happen, I think that's consistent with my experiences over the years. Whenever you do that people are surprised what you can get from good analog. But that being said, especially during quarantine for like the last year, I've been listening to a lot of digital with Qobuz, and it is so good and so easy that there's just tremendous value from that. So, it doesn't have to be a binary choice. If you can do it, you should get both. You're going to end up spending more to get great analog. Obviously, you got to spend more on music too when you're buying records versus streaming services. So having both in your system, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think, too, part of the joy of the audiophile hobby, while we have all this time to burn, is getting a hands-on approach. There's nothing more physical and more like tactile than putting a record on. And we've said this in other podcasts, too. You put a record on, you physically feel it on there. The needle physically touches the thing. It's a process. It's a labor of love. And if you like tweaking things or just really want to be involved in an engaging listening experience, there's no better way to do that with a turntable and analog sound. Granted, if you want to like DJ some stuff up from your friends real quick and pull it from anywhere and do it quickly, obviously digital makes that way, way easier. But I think both have their own merits, and both have like, I would almost say like a kind of intimacy with the record where you're like so intimately involved in making the sound that you're maybe more emotionally invested in the way you hear it, and then you feel a connection. It's all just kind of in your head, but I think there are rewards for both sides. And not to specifically like just break one off than the other. I certainly hope that in 100 years we are still listening to records. I think that would be just a great thing.
Me too, for a lot of reasons, I hope for that. But I'll give you the kind of hot take on this with digital versus analog. 10 years ago, if you would have asked me that question, it would have been a very straightforward analog all day. Right? Like, I'll take the vinyl all day. And I still don't think digital has surpassed it. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that sentiment, but that's just how I feel. But I will say now with digital, it's gotten so good that I don't feel like I'm missing out on a whole lot listening to digital. And I think the difference is how good DACs have gotten, focusing on areas of ringing and jitter and all, whatever that the designers have focused on. DACs have gotten a lot more musical, more natural sounding to my ear. And I think the quality of the streaming service, especially with Qobuz, has made it so easy. It's blended convenience and sound quality extremely well that, digital is phenomenal. And if that's all they can do or all they want to do, hey, there's nothing wrong with that because digital is really good right now. Getting back to the hierarchy, you've got source, analog, or digital. And when you're budgeting for it, you can get great value for money with digital. Analog, if you're getting into that, it's worth spending a little bit more on. If you're planning on having a turntable, that's a good investment. And again, it's like the amplifier statement we made earlier that 20 years from now, a good turntable is still going to be a good turntable, whatever you buy today. And most, whether it's a MoFi like we make or a Rega or a Techniques, like these things are made to last. Nobody's really reinvented the wheel. There's been iterations and improvements with turntables over the years, but I think a good turntable is a relatively worthwhile and secure investment when you look at this budget hierarchy.
So we've talked about a lot of different elements of speaker listening, and we've kind of established a base of this hierarchy. What happens to the hierarchy as we move further up the funnel?
I think a funnel is a good visualization of this, and really, or a pyramid that we're building. And we built our foundation with recording, room, source, speakers, amp, preamp. And just like a pyramid, as you kind of go up, the things on top get smaller and smaller, right? They take up less of the area of the triangle here. And the next thing on our hierarchy is power conditioning. It's still a significant part of system building, but I think for a lot of people, it's not going to rank as high as speakers or sources when it comes to the overall influence of their system's performance. But I think power conditioning is an important aspect that often gets missed when building a system. with power, it's a little bit tricky because a lot of the great recordings of the early days were done. They didn't have power conditioning, so you could easily dismiss this thing as opportunistic, right? That, oh, well, that's just an attachment to a system. It's not critical. But I think the atmosphere has changed, and that's due to all the noise on our AC lines, whether it's coming into our homes. Really, a big area of concern is the noise generated by the things in our homes, especially switching power supplies, which are the kind used for cell phone chargers, computer chargers. All kinds of devices now use these switching power supplies, which pollute the quality of the power in your home. On top of that, a lot of your components, your audio components themselves, use switching power supplies now, and they start to interact with each other. And all these things are measurable. But then the question is, well, is it audible? It usually doesn't manifest itself as like a ground loop would, like a hum in your system. It's one of those things that you only notice once it's gone. Once you remove the noise, all of a sudden you realize, like, wow, there's more contrast, more dynamic range, more clarity to my system. It's because the noise floor is lower. The noise is gone. And so you could really make the argument that until you have that low noise floor, by eliminating that noise, you really don't know what your system's capable of, because that's always going to mask the performance of your components and the overall sound that you get from your system.
Yeah, and for those of you that might find this type of thinking upsetting, I want to just reiterate that we're already past the component part. We're talking about things that are the next level, like things that you can absolutely, at least in my perspective, you can overlook for a while until you want to move to the next level of things. And this is one of those arenas where I would start to like poke my head around and say, hey, okay, I got all this other stuff set up how I want. Maybe introduce or try it out. Hey, what does this do to what I already have? I don't think John is suggesting, and neither am I, that this be the first thing that you run out and get when building your system. We're up the pyramid, right? We're ancillary, we're next level stuff.
So to reiterate what you're saying, there's 5 things that come first before we get into this. It's the speakers, it's the source, it's the preamp, amp, etc. This is that final layer, the cherry on top, right? And that's why we use this whole pyramid visualization, that the next 3 things we talk about, power and then 2 other things, you don't necessarily need them to have a system, but to really take your system to its best, highest performance level, these are the things that are going to help you get there. So power conditioning, I think, is important. On top of that, if you think about what you're plugging your system into, it's not just reducing the noise, it's making sure all the power gets to all of your components. So a lot of people that have gone down this path before will talk about, well, hey, I have a power conditioner, but I plug my amps into the wall directly, because they recognize that a lot of power strips or power conditioners even really limit the amount of current that their big amplifiers can get. So it's thinking all these things through that, I think you said it early on, everything can make a difference, that you just have to pay attention to this. It's a good thing to experiment with, listen to. You may think you're getting everything out of your system, but you might not be. And so getting a power conditioner, a few of them even if you can, borrow something from your dealer, and see if you hear the difference. I think you will, what those differences are, and then what's really going to allow your system to perform at its peak level. So power conditioning is an important aspect of that.
I'd just like to add, I realize that the further we get up this pyramid, the more controversy we're going to run into. These things are the things that people, like I had said before, they fall off the scale because people with the less resolving system can often hear no difference. And I recognize that there are scenarios where you plug in your thing, you buy this other thing, and you hear no difference. I can imagine that to be a completely true statement from some people's perspective. But we're really talking about the evolution here of budgeting as the budgets get bigger and bigger. So please keep that in mind if you're very upset right now.
Yeah. I think, we said earlier, it's easy to be cynical. I think it's easy to dismiss things that you haven't experimented with. I mean, we've all been along this journey. If you spend any time in audio, 25 years ago, you asked me, can a power cable change the way a system sounds? I would have laughed at you, and I would have said snake oil and all this stuff like you normally hear in audio forums. But then you experience it, and as I think you get more experience and you get more knowledgeable about this, you recognize that, wow, these things that might not match my own intuition can actually make a difference, and you're going to go further and further down the rabbit hole and discover more and more. And that's why these things are towards the top of the pyramid. That if you're just starting out, this is not where you start, but recognize it's going to be an aspect of system building. Maybe not today, but eventually it's going to be something you want to look into.
Okay, so what's the next controversy we're getting into?
Well, I think after power, which still ranks pretty high on the hierarchy in terms of like where it's positioned, the next thing I always recommend addressing are microphonics, which I think our industry is really dubbed more as vibration control devices. And I think if you looked at a pyramid, yeah, the section of this is getting smaller in terms of its overall impact to the system. But if you have a very high-end system, it can have a pretty big impact. But in general, this is one of the later steps in system building that I ask people to start experimenting with, is by placing footers, vibration control footers, under whether it's loudspeakers or components. And you can really be surprised at how it doesn't fundamentally change the system, or at least it shouldn't, but that you're going to get that much more out of the things you already own if you address microphonics.
I want to just insert real quick, though, with the exception of the turntable. I feel like there is a dramatic effect on a turntable, which the needle is resting in a groove, if you don't have proper isolation. You don't want the bass vibrations of your music to go in and jumble that needle around. So I would say that there's an exception to turntables, but please go on with you're talking about components as a whole and speakers.
Yeah, I think most people accept that turntables are basically, reading vibrations, and so you definitely don't want any vibrations from your floor or subwoofers affecting what the turntable's doing. But I think where people are often surprised is putting these vibration control devices under DACs, under things without moving parts, how that can actually make an impact to the sound. And again, that doesn't match most people's intuition, but when you're exposed to it and you listen to it, it's there. It's apparent. And when you talk to engineers that specialize in this area, and they can tell you about how transformers are vibrating, how capacitors vibrate, and how those vibrations have microphonics and impact the overall sound that you're getting, it starts to make sense. And it really is kind of common knowledge among engineers. It just hasn't always been expressed clearly, I think, to end consumers, to audiophiles. So it's often dismissed as another example of snake oil. And look, certainly some things maybe cost more than they should. That's up to you to decide. But don't be scared to try these things out. And there's some high-value devices out there. I think my very first experience with vibration control was a little thing called a VibraPod that may have cost $4 each. And that made a difference on my CD player. So there's things to try. It's, again, higher up the hierarchy, but it does make a difference, and it's going to give you a more resolved, more refined sounding system if you address this. It's better to spend a little bit of money than to not address it at all.
All right. I'm on bated breath. Is there another one? Is there something else? What's next?
Oh, yeah, the most controversial subject of all that really triggers a lot of folks is cables. I think it might surprise some people that cables are the last thing on this list because you get so much misguided kind of expertise out there that they try to shove expensive cables down your throat as being essential. And we can all say there's different motivations for that. And I think some of it is just purely that it's a reaction towards all the negativity that you have. The other side is shouting louder, right? So we have to shout loud back. To me, cables are an important part of the system. I've had experiences with very expensive equipment that the sound just was not right. The overall sound of the system was not right until we changed the cables. So although it's the last part of this, all of these steps are interconnected. I think that's the big thing to take away from this. People so often focus on one area while ignoring the rest. And they think, well, that can only make so much difference. It can't change the overall sound. Well, even though this is the last area that we've deemed the least important, it's still important. Because one cable, if it's the wrong cable, can negatively impact your overall experience. So cables are important. I think we need to recognize that, especially analog cables, that should be unquestionable, that they make a difference. But it doesn't mean you should or have to spend a lot on cables. The goal is to find good cables that are a reasonable match to your system, both in terms of performance, sound, and budget. But just remember, this is an aspect to pay attention to, that when you're putting a system together, you should listen to a few different cables from different manufacturers especially, and see how that impacts your system.
One of the more unfortunate circumstances surrounding the backlash to these things not making a difference in some people's mind is that people have resolved themselves to rely on measurements heavily, and that's not an issue for me. I think measurements absolutely can help you translate a situation. Actually, the more important thing is to listen for yourself. I heard a quote on Facebook the other day where they were talking about measurements, and the guy said, well, what about the ears? Don't you think your ears should be the ultimate measuring tool? And the person replied, ears are notoriously faulty measurement devices. How could you ever trust them? And I don't know, I get what he's saying, but the problem I had was I didn't know if he was joking or not.
I've heard that statement made a lot over the years, and you know what? It's another one of those things that's, he's partially correct, even more than partially correct, that it would be very difficult in terms of designing these products to do it completely by ear. It would take a lot longer, first of all, and you're going to go down a lot of wrong paths before you get on the right path. So measurements keep you kind of focused on those things that make a difference, that are obviously objective. And I think this is an important part of this discussion we're having, that there's a trend that people are being really drawn to this objectivist measurement side of the hobby. And that's because it's a confusing hobby. We said earlier, it's full of contradictions, full of dogma. We're talking about 8 different things you have to pay attention to build a system, right? Unless you're buying active speakers or something else. So it's tough. And when you can't go in and to listen to everything that you want to listen to, there's no shop that carries probably everything you're interested in. It takes time. It takes money. You just want answers. And I think measurements try to provide you those answers. But when you talk to guys, whether it's John Atkinson or other people that spend their careers in this industry measuring, they still say, we can't predict with 100% certainty how something is going to sound based on the measurements. We have a good idea because we have experience, but it doesn't quite get us there. And at the end of the day, this is a hobby, at least to me, about appealing to one's senses. Just like buying wine. I don't care how wine measures. I care what it tastes like and how it makes me feel. It's the same thing with audio. How does it make me feel is what's important. So while my ears are faulty, but they're the ones I have. And at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. These are the guideposts along your journey to build a system. But you have to listen. If you really want to get something that's going to satisfy you, you have to listen, spend the time, get the experience, and you're going to find something that works great for you.
Yeah, I think you might be surprised. I think you might be surprised not only on what you discover, but how it makes you feel when you discover these things. It's as much about, I think, in a weird way, self-exploration as looking at this external measurement on a graph, right? You can see that, you can ingest that. That's a form of entertainment, no doubt. But I think that you might get some distinct pleasure in the experience, in this type of real kind of sense of emotion or whatever you get from your music, and the idea of that marriage with gear. Experimentation. the joy of buying a product and implementing it new, tweaking things, and focusing on those kind of joy points, and not necessarily focusing on how everything's overpriced or the negative things. I'll be the first to admit there are plenty of negative things about this hobby that you can get involved in. But if you consciously make a choice to listen, engage, and look at what you can get out of this hobby from a positive perspective, I think that's what it's really about.
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, I love this stuff. After 20 plus years of doing it, I still love swapping out amplifiers and hearing the differences, or even swapping out cables, quite honestly, and saying, oh, wow, this one changes the system in this way or that way, and then finding what you prefer. And you'll find those preferences are going to change and evolve the more time you spend in the high-end audio hobby. That, what was great to you 10 years ago might be different than today. And, it's about the music, but it's also about the journey, and I think it's one of the fun aspects of what we do.
Can you just kind of tell me why you think that's an important thing to think about, being positive about the hobby?
I think it's important because there's a lot of newcomers. If you put yourself in the shoes of a newcomer to this hobby and you start Googling audio and you end up in these forums, and I'm not anti-forum. I've learned a lot from people in forums, don't get me wrong, but there's also a lot of angry people in forums with very strong opinions that don't know you on a personal level. And I think it's important that we all recognize that this is fun. It should be fun, that there's shiny, happy people having fun in this hobby. And it's not always so dogmatic and so black and white. So it's important to show that positivity that exists in the audio hobby.
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there, but unfortunately, I feel like one of the things that's a drawback is that you have to comb through a lot of negativity to get the information you want. It's not presented as succinctly as it should be in that scenario. So
yeah, I think it makes it harder, right? You join these forums and you say, hey folks, I'm looking at speaker A, speaker B, and speaker C, and all you're going to get are 20 people that say, well, you should consider speaker X, Y, Z. That's just more confusing. It could be good, but yeah, it's a tough hobby to get into because it's not just buying something off the shelf. You're putting together different components that interact with each other that are all going to determine how your overall system sounds. And hopefully this guide of where to focus, where you're going to get good value for money, helps people simplify.
John, thanks so much for helping out with the show. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brian.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and AudioHead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.